At my husband's company gala, he lifted his wine glass and laughed. "Don't ask my wife about business," Russ said to the table. "She wouldn't understand." A few people chuckled politely. I smiled out of habit. Then the director sitting across from us leaned forward, squinting at my face like he was trying to remember a song. "Wait a second," he said slowly. "Ella Porter from Mediquip in Greensboro?" I blinked. He smiled wider. "You were my first boss." My husband spat out his wine. The Western Ballroom in uptown Charlotte smelled faintly of red wine and lemon polish. The jazz trio near the stage had been playing the same mellow standards for an hour. A waiter walked past with a tray of bourbon glasses, ice clinking softly. It was October, cool outside, warm inside. Russ loved these events. Company gala nightides were where he performed best. The suit, the handshake, the laugh that carried across the table, just loud enough for other executives to hear. I had been attending these dinners with him for almost 15 years. You learned the choreography after a while. Smile, nod, laugh when the others laugh. I wore a navy Adriana Pell dress I'd bought at Dillard's the week before. Not flashy, just clean lines, comfortable enough to sit through 3 speeches and a rubbery chicken dinner. Russ had already had 2 glasses of Cabernet when the conversation turned toward logistics and shipping delays. A vice president named Carl was complaining about supply chain issues. "Ports are still backed up," Carl said, shaking his head. "Half our vendors can't promise delivery dates anymore." I had spent almost 2 decades in operations before stepping away. Problems like that were my old language. Without really thinking, I leaned forward slightly. "Well, if your forecasting model still assumes stable freight schedules." Russ cut me off mid-sentence with a chuckle. "Don't ask my wife about business." He said a few people laughed. She wouldn't understand. The words hung in the air just long enough for everyone to hear them clearly. I smiled automatically. That reflex had been built over years. But something inside me shifted in that moment because it wasn't the first time Russ had said something like that. It was just the first time he said it in front of so many people who mattered. Across from me, the man with the salt and pepper beard tilted his head. He had been watching quietly. "Hang on," he said, pointing lightly at me. "Ella Porter, right?" I frowned slightly. "Yes." His eyes lit up. "Daniel Ruiz," he said, tapping his chest. "Warehouse supervisor, Mediquip, Greensboro, 2006. It took a second. Then I remembered. Skinny kid, nervous, fresh out of the army, always carrying a notebook. "Daniel," I said. He laughed. "You hired me," he said. A few people at the table turned to look between us. Daniel leaned back in his chair and shook his head like he still couldn't believe it. "You were my first boss," he said. "Best one I ever had, too." Russ choked on his wine, literally choked. He coughed hard, grabbing his napkin while a red stain splashed across the tablecloth. I handed him a clean napkin without looking at him. "You okay, honey?" I said calmly. He nodded stiffly, still coughing. The table had gone quiet. Daniel continued, smiling at me. "You probably don't remember," he said, "but that winter storm in 2007 shut down half our warehouse. Trucks stuck everywhere. Everyone else was panicking. I remembered very clearly, you built that color-coded recovery board." Daniel said, 3 shifts, rerouted inventory, got everything moving again in 48 hours. Carl leaned forward. "Seriously," he said. Daniel nodded. "That's where I learned operations management," he said. Elaine ran that place like a machine. I felt heat rise in my face. It had been a long time since anyone talked about my old career like that. Russ had stopped coughing now. He wiped his mouth and forced a laugh. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "Elaine used to dabble in that stuff." "Dabble?" The word landed softly but heavily. Daniel looked confused. "Dabble," he said. I shrugged gently. "That was a long time ago." The waiter arrived with dinner plates, then baked chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes arranged neatly in the center. Conversation slowly resumed, but the tone had changed. Carl asked me where Metaquip had been based. Another manager asked how big the Greensboro operation had been. Daniel kept shaking his head with a smile. I can't believe we ran into each other like this, he said. Russ barely spoke for the rest of the dinner. The drive home was quiet. Charlotte's skyline faded behind us as we merged onto Independence Boulevard. Streetlights slid across the windshield in long orange streaks. Russ gripped the steering wheel harder than usual. I watched the road ahead. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. You blindsided me tonight. I turned my head. Slightly. How? You didn't tell me Daniel worked there? I didn't know he did, Russ scoffed. Well, you sure seemed eager to remind everyone about your little career. I stared at him. My little career? You know what I mean? He said sharply. You made me look stupid. The words settled into the car like cold air. Traffic hummed around us. I didn't say anything. I said quietly. You didn't have to. He shook his head. That whole first boss thing. People are going to remember that. I looked out the passenger window. The city lights had faded now. Suburbs stretching out toward Matthews. You're worried about that? I asked. Of course I am, Russ snapped. Image matters. I nodded slowly. There it was. Not embarrassment, not regret, just fear that someone had briefly seen a version of me he preferred to keep invisible. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When we got home, I went upstairs and removed my earrings in the bathroom mirror. The house was quiet, too quiet. Russ was downstairs pouring himself another drink. I studied my reflection under the bright vanity. Lights, 48, a few silver strands near my temple I hadn't noticed before. Fine lines near the corners of my eyes, but my posture was still straight, my gaze steady. For a moment, I tried to imagine the woman Daniel had described at dinner. The one who rebuilt warehouses after snowstorms, the one people listened to, the one who trained new managers. She didn't feel like a stranger. She felt like someone who had simply stepped out of the room for a long time and suddenly realized she might be able to walk back in. Downstairs, a cabinet closed loudly. Russ was still irritated, but I felt strangely calm because something had shifted tonight. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet realization settling into place. My husband hadn't forgotten who I used to be. He just preferred the version of me that stayed smaller. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure I wanted to play that role anymore. And once that thought appeared, it was impossible to push it back down. The next morning, I woke up before Russ. That wasn't unusual. I've always been an early riser. Years of running warehouse shifts trained my body to wake up around 6 o'clock, whether I wanted to or not. The house in Matthews was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels comfortable most mornings. Hardwood floors, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint chirp of birds outside the kitchen window. I poured myself coffee into a Carolina Panthers mug Russ had bought during one of his team-building trips with clients. The mug was chipped on the rim. I noticed things like that now. Maybe I always had. I sat at the kitchen island and looked out the window toward the maple tree in the backyard. The leaves were just starting to turn red. Last night's gala kept replaying in my mind, Russ laughing, Daniel recognizing me, the sudden silence at the table. But what stayed with me most was the drive home, not his anger, the reason behind it. Russ wasn't upset because he'd embarrassed me. He was upset because someone else had reminded the room I used to be someone worth listening to. Footsteps creaked on the stairs behind me. Russ appeared in the kitchen wearing sweatpants and his usual Saturday morning scowl. He opened the cabinet and grabbed a glass. Coffee? I asked. He shrugged. I poured him a cup anyway. For a moment, we stood there in the quiet kitchen like two coworkers who didn't know how to start a conversation. Finally, he sighed. Look, he said, rubbing his forehead. About last night, waited. He shifted his weight. I was joking, he said. You know how those dinners are? I didn't answer right away. He glanced at me, trying to read my face. You're not actually upset about that, are you? The question surprised me a little because it told me something. Russ genuinely didn't think he'd done anything wrong. I'm not upset, I said carefully. Good, he replied quickly. He took a sip of coffee and grimaced. Need sugar. He reached for the cabinet again. Then he placed a small bouquet of grocery store roses on the counter. I hadn't even noticed he was holding them. They look nice, he said. It wasn't exactly an apology, more like a peace offering. 20 years of marriage builds habits. You learn how disagreements usually end. A small gesture, a few days of quiet, then everything slides back into the old routine. For a moment, I almost accepted that pattern again. I touched the petals of the roses lightly. Thank you, I said. Russ relaxed a little. See, he said, no big deal. He checked his phone. I've got a call with Dallas at 10 o'clock. Clear his throat. Then he kissed my cheek and headed upstairs to shower. Just like that, the moment was over, or it should have been, but something about it bothered me. Not the flowers, the ease, the way he assumed everything was. Settled without really talking about it. I finished my coffee slowly. Then I walked upstairs to the small office we barely used anymore. A cardboard box sat in the closet labeled old files. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were notebooks, binders, and an old Franklin CVY planner from 2004. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of use. For a second, I just held it in my hands.